Our next speaker is Orandi Harris, and he is a software development engineer in test at the company called Real Decoy. So Orandi is based on island of Jamaica, and he's like to learn something new and consider himself as a tech enthusiast. Orandi will speak about visual testing with WebDriver and Percy IO. So Orandi, the stage is yours.
Hello, hi, thank you. Hi everyone. So let me share my screen so we can start it. I hope everyone can see my screen. So the title of the talk today is Demystifying Visual Testing with WebDriverIO and Percy IO. So the agenda that we're going to go through today is going to cover these four main areas. We're going to talk about what is visual testing. We're going to talk about what WebDriverIO is and what cool features exist in the framework. We're going to talk about how to get started with visual testing with WebDriverIO and also how to use Percy IO to set up visual tests. So before we get into the presentation, let's talk a little bit about me. So as mentioned before, my name is Orandi Harris. I like to call myself an advocate for testing. I am a big fan of different series. I watch a different type of television shows. I'm also a music lover. I like music of varying genres. And most importantly, I'm a Jamaican. Let's get started with what is visual testing. So visual testing is focused on what your users see and interact with. Sometimes you'd hear it being referred to as automated UI testing or visual regression testing. It's all the same thing. Now, let's focus on a key concept here. People know functional tests. Functional tests are more traditional software testing practices that focus on things like unit testing, integration testing, and end-to-end testing. The functional tests normally check a software in terms of how it behaves, checking if it behaves as it should, but it doesn't do a validation of visual correctness, right? Now, visual testing, on the other hand, offers that validation. It checks the software to make sure that it looks as how it should, and it does this through test automation and image processing. So there are some challenges that the paradigm behind visual testing has solved. The main thing is that it's critical to the development lifecycle because it is not equipped, because functional testing is not equipped to check an application's visual elements. In terms of asserting for visual correctness, it's not necessarily the best method because it tends to be very brittle. These type of tests tend to break easily. There are things that can make your test pass, but it normally will result in a visual regression, meaning something like a CSS class changing, for example. That might be a problem. That might cause an issue. And on top of that, it is hard to account for visual bugs that are caused by rendering in different browsers and different screen sizes. That's what visual testing aims to address. How do you know what your application's UI looks like in a smaller screen or a medium-sized screen or a large-sized screen? So visual testing solves all these challenges by looking at your software from a purely visual standpoint. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care about what is the underlying code base. It only.
Orandi, I'm sorry. Are you showing some presentation? Because I think you forgot to share screen.
Oh, that's what I was wondering if it was sharing. It wasn't sharing?
Nope.
Oh man, that's bad. And I went all the way through. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, everyone heard what I was saying, but I can actually, let me start real quick again. So just to let everyone see again what the agenda is of what we're going over. Apologies for that technical difficulty. So we're just going to talk real quick about visual testing, WebDriverIO, how to get started with visual testing with WebDriverIO and Percy IO, right? Again, going through the introduction of who I am. as mentioned before, these are 4 main things that is important about me. Again, going back to the slide of what visual testing is, sometimes you hear this term again being called automated UI testing or visual regression testing. So to make sure that I hit the point again, the main idea behind visual testing is that it solves particular software challenges that come out of a software development lifecycle by looking at your application from a visual standpoint. Oh, just making sure everyone is seeing the screen. Just making.
Yep, we can see your screen, so everything's great.
Okay, just making sure. All right, so let's get into the benefits of visual testing real quick. So, visual testing allows you to gain complete confidence in your software product, because now you're able to validate your application from 2 sides. You're able to validate it from a functional standpoint through unit testing and integration testing and end-to-end testing. But now you can set up visual tests as well that can validate your application from the UI level to make sure that there are no visual regressions and application looks exactly as how it should. It does allow you to save time and resources, because as we know, if you're going to look at an application from a manual standpoint and you're not going to automate it, it is going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be very labor intensive to go through several screens or several pages of application. And this is the most important point of visual testing. It enables you to have a greater collaboration between your software development team, because now other persons can join your process of validating the UI of the application. So maybe in your development team, you have a process of the devs go through pull requests and you have a peer review type session, and that's how you check what the CSS looks like. In terms of the other persons from your team, from like the business standpoint, like project managers and so on, they might have to look at the actual application when it's deployed before you can validate it. What visual testing allows you to do is to skip that step of deploying it to a live environment per se. You can deploy it to a test environment, for instance, and then look at what the screenshots look like. Look at what the images of your site look like right now in its current state, and does it match what it's expected? So now we'll talk about WebDriverIO and what the framework is. So WebDriverIO is defined as this next-gen WebDriver test framework for Node.js. In short terms, it is a Node.js-based testing framework that allows you to write end-to-end tests in a very concise and quick method. The framework itself has a lot of documentation. It's really, really well maintained. The team behind it ensures that they keep it up to date. And if you really need help in like getting set up or getting started, you can always reach out to the members of the team behind the framework to get started. So here's some features that came out in WebDriverIO version 5. So it allows you to run your code in a synchronous manner, right? It has support for TypeScript if you want to write your files in TypeScript. It enables the use of different automation protocols, like the WebDriver protocol, for instance, or if you want to use the DevTools protocol, you can. It allows you to also retry tests that have failed. So sometimes your tests can be a little bit flaky because of different reasons. You have the ability to do retries if you want. The framework has support for different test runners, such as Mocha, Jasmine, or Cucumber. And it also has plugins for visual testing. So to touch on the point about synchronous or allowing your code to run in a synchronous manner, this is how WebDriverIO does it. It does it through what it calls sync mode. So it has 2 features, sync mode and async mode. So on the screen now, you're seeing what an asynchronous test looks like. Basically, every single line, or most of the lines that require some form of browser call or some form of element fetching from the browser, it has to be wrapped in an async await type of syntax. You can also use promises if you want to go down that route, but this is normally how it would look if you are not using sync mode in WebDriverIO. Now, if you're using sync mode, if sync mode is turned on, you don't have to use async await on the different calls if you want to fetch a particular element from the web page. You don't need to wrap it in async await. You just write it out in normal syntax. And why it works is because every single call, browser element call, is wrapped with fibers in sync mode. So what exactly are fibers? So the long and short of it is that fibers allow you to run asynchronous methods in a synchronous way on the Node.js event loop. It's because it's using a computer science technique or theory, which is focusing on how do you distribute CPU cycles between fibers. So a lot of us might be familiar with threading. Threading is one way of doing multitasking in a CPU. A fiber is going off the same principle. However, it's more related to the programmer. The programmer has to define when is it that your code is going to yield to another fiber so that it can take up a CPU cycle. And to get started with setting up sync mode in WebDriverIO, it's really easy. All you have to do is install the sync package using npm. And if you want to uninstall it, if you don't want to use sync mode and want to use async mode, you just have to uninstall that particular package. All right, so let's get into what Percy.io is. So Percy.io is a visual testing as a service platform, right? What it allows you to do essentially is review the visual changes in your application, and it offers you a toolkit to get started in visual testing in whatever framework that you choose. For today's presentation, I'll be showing you how to get started with it with WebDriverIO. But if you are interested in using it in, say, Cypress or Java or any other language or framework, you can. They have a lot of documentation on their website that shows you how to get started. So let's look at our demo for today. So our first steps are to ensure that you have the Node.js installed on your computer. It has to be the latest version. At the point of my presentation, the LTS at this point is 12.16.3. Running these commands in your particular working directory will allow you to get started. So initializing an npm package or an npm project into your working directory, installing the WDIO CLI, using this npx WDIO config-y method will essentially say to WebDriverIO, okay, I want to get started with setting up my test. So it's going to create a config file for you with particular settings in there. This file will now be what you use to execute your test. And then using this command of npm install at Percy/WebDriverIO is installing the Percy SDK into your project. So if I switch over screens here, that's all right. I still hope everybody is seeing my screen. Now we're looking at the Visual Studio Code. So I've already gone ahead and set up a project. So in this project, it's just a very simple web application. It's a static website that was generated with Gatsby, and I added in two types of tests in here: functional tests and visual tests. So let me open up my folders here. So let's look at what a functional test is like. So for this particular site, if I was to write a functional UI test on the application, this is the kind of format that I would go through. I would be looking for particular elements on the screen, and I would check if they are actually displayed using this expect syntax here, right? So I'm actually going to show you what the execution of this will look like. So if I type the command, actually, before I type the command, let me show you what the two commands are that we'll be going through. So we have this npm test and this npm visual test. Sorry, we're gonna execute npm run test and an npm run visual test today, right? So the first one is gonna do our functional test, and the second one is gonna do a visual test. So let's just do npm run test. And here you're seeing the WebDriverIO test runner starting. It's going to spin up a browser window for us. We're using Chrome in this instance, and it's going to navigate to the site, and it's going to do the checks that I had specified in my code. So here, okay, something failed, which is expected. That's fine, right? But this just shows you exactly how you do this visual validation from a functional standpoint, right? You use these assertions to check if elements exist on a page or not. Now, let's look at what the visual test would look like. So in this setup here, I have pulled in this method called Percy snapshot, which is coming from the npm package that we talked about before with the Percy SDK installed inside of it, right? This method is what allows you to take the different screenshots of your application of your application. So in this setup, we're using the Mocha framework, which is why we have a describe block and then several it blocks. So the describe block is the broader test suite. We have this method here called before each, which before each individual step or test, it's going to do these commands that are defined within the brackets. So here we're going to maximize the browser window, and then we're going to navigate to this particular URL where the site is hosted. So my first test from a visual standpoint is to load the home page and then just take a screenshot, right? So here we're passing to the Percy snapshot method 3 things: the browser object, a title, which is the title of the particular screenshot, and then this options object. Inside this object, it contains different parameters. So you can put in different properties in here. In this case, we're passing in different widths because we want our test to check the site against these particular widths. So let me just run these tests. I will get to the second one in a second, but I just wanted to execute this test first. So now Percy is starting. And the main difference that you're seeing here is that the WebDriverIO test runner is executing, but the Percy SDK is wrapping around that so that it's able to go into the page, take the screenshot, and then send this to PercyIO's platform or dashboard so that I am able to see what the screenshot looks like. So as you can see here, Percy gave me a message to say it finalized the build, and I can go to it at that URL. So let's pull it up. So this is the PercyIO dashboard. I had gone ahead and already set up all of this and configured all of it to save on time. So let me just do a quick refresh here. All right, so as you can see, just a few seconds ago, the test that I just executed has come back, and it has 2 snapshots that I haven't reviewed yet. So now it's showing me what the home page looks like. And it's showing me 2 things here. One of these, the image on the left is referred to as the baseline. The baseline image is your reference point for your visual test, right? So when you're getting started, you're not gonna have a baseline in the initial phase for your first test. But on the second iteration of a test, you'll now have a new baseline that is compared against for each subsequent test. So here we have our baseline, and then we have what actually was picked up from the screen just now. Remember when I talked about the options object in the Percy snapshot method where I passed in a particular width? Here you can see them, right? The 992 pixels and the 1200 pixels. So you're seeing the screenshots at that particular screen size. Now, if I click on the image on the right, you're going to notice that it's highlighted in red. So what it's doing now is Percy has identified that there are slight differences between both images here. If I didn't click on this, both things kind of look the same, just a little bit. But if you look a little bit closer, you do notice that there are small differences. So the biggest difference is that these 2 buttons are different colors. And then there's an iframe on the page that's slightly throwing the test off. So it's a little bit confused about what's going on here. So before I even get to that point, another cool thing about PercyIO is that it takes your screenshots in 2 different browsers. Right now, they have support for Chrome and Firefox. So if you want to know what your site looks like in both, this is the platform that you can use. So here, we see the same screenshots in Chrome and Firefox. But you're noticing the difference in Firefox that the iframe video that's on the page, it's not loading. It's not showing in Firefox, but it shows just fine in Chrome. So for the next test that is defined here, it's showing another key function or feature of PercyIO, which is called Percy CSS. So essentially, if you have dynamic content on your page, which would be an iframe, a chart, or anything like that, you can use Percy CSS to exclude it from your screenshot so that you're now able to take a fresh screenshot minus that dynamic content. Also, you can use this to target specific elements on the screen. So say you only wanted to look at the header, you can pass in the particular CSS rule to show the header, and that was what the screenshot will be based on. So that is why in this build up here, you're seeing homepage minus iframe, and now we're seeing the same page, but there's no iframe anymore. So this is how you would have gone through the process of ignoring dynamic content. So in terms of a workflow, right, as you're seeing here, I have the images on my master branch, and then I have the changes that are coming in from my PR. Now, a key part of using Percy is that once you hook it up into your source control tools, for instance, if you're using GitHub, once you make a pull request and you're linking it to a particular branch, it does the checks on the branch for you in terms of CSS. So here, I've connected Netlify and Percy to my GitHub. So once I make a PR, I see these different checks appear. So here, I'm notified immediately that, okay, there are 2 visual changes that need some review. You need to go in and check it, which is what would bring me to this screen. And this is where I would say, okay, yeah, this is now the new baseline. This is what I want it to look like. So I can click on approve. Or in a development lifecycle, you go through the request changes option, and then you can talk to or speak to particular team members so that you're now able to, rectify whatever the particular issue could be. All right, so let's switch back here. Okay, so in terms of best practices for doing your visual tests, the most important one is don't just do it. Don't just get into it right away. The main reason for this is because you can try to focus on other test levels to try to improve your overall test coverage. So you need to look at your application on a whole and see if there are gaps in the other testing levels that you're missing that you could use to now improve the quality of your application. It's very important to use or to remain consistent in the language that you use for your tests. So here I'm saying to use the present perfect tense to describe what's happening versus what has happened. Why? Is because when someone else looks at your test or looks at a screenshot, they need to know exactly what is going on at this moment. So say, for instance, okay, there's a login flow that you need to go through and you're setting up visual tests for that. It's very important that you use the right language, the right tense to explain each step in that login flow as the screenshots are being taken. Otherwise, it's going to throw off anybody who is just looking at this for the first time. It's also important to narrow your focus. Having a component level focus is very good. So looking at individual components on your screen, it's very important to hone in on that, because then you can see how each individual component is rendering and what is happening in terms of the CSS for those particular elements. It's also important to use some level of logging so that you can find the reasons why your UI isn't looking the way it's expected. That, again, is just because you want to keep communication very clear. You want the persons on your team to be able to know, okay, this test failed, but why did it fail? Can I get some understanding to why it failed? And then the last point is to leverage things like component libraries or style guides to help you in validating how your page looks. This is one of the points that I like to tell a lot of devs, that it's important to have these things set up, because when you have a tester, say you have an independent testing that's not necessarily a part of your development team, when they come in and look at what your application is, if they don't have some idea, some design or something to show them, okay, this is what it's supposed to look like, they have no idea to validate it properly when setting up these visual tests. Okay, so we've come to the end. If you guys haven't caught any other points that I said, or because of my technical error in the beginning, you missed most of what I said, here are 4 key points that I want you to take home. Functional tests make your visual validation harder. It's just because the functional test can only look at your app from a function point of view. It can only see if something is displayed on the screen, yes, but it can't tell you how it looks exactly. it's important that you leverage visual testing to kind of rest your eyes, to spend less time manually going through the process of checking each individual screens in a particular flow. And this way you're able to mitigate or as I said here, squash the visual bugs easier. As we've seen here from the demo, Percy and WebDriverIO are a match made in heaven. It was really easy to get set up with both frameworks, to get started with the testing and to set up the test. And it's important to understand that you don't just run into visual testing without setting up your proper workflow of how to leverage the technique. If you want maximum success, you're going to have to spend time as a team to work together to work out what your workflow is going to look like with visual testing included. So before I go, here's some key resources for everybody. These resources actually helped me to get started. So here are links to the Percy IO docs. Again, their getting started page is really simple. It explains everything step by step for whatever framework it is that you're using. WebDriverIO does the same thing as well from their documentation as well. Also, WebDriverIO has different pages for different versions of the framework. So if you're using version 5 or using version 6 or whatever version you're using, they have documentation listed out for it, and it's kind of really easy to read and really easy to get into. Test Automation U is another site that you can also use to kind of learn about how to use WebDriverIO, go into more detail than I went into today, and learn more about it. Or you can go to this YouTube channel. It's called Front End Testing with Kevin. He has different videos about using WebDriverIO for different use cases, and he goes through it in detail, and it's really clear and concise. If you need something, if you just want to watch something, watch a tutorial to get started real quick. All right, so that is it. Thank you everybody for listening. Thank you all for your time. And yeah, at this point, if we have any questions, I can answer them.
Hey, I think we got it. Yes, thank you, Orandi. That was an amazing presentation, and people in chat are saying like, great presentation. There was pretty clear presentation, amazing talk. Orandi, a great guy, super nice.
Thank you, guys.
So thanks for your time with us. Please don't forget that we are collecting your questions on our Q&A section, and we will discuss them on our panel discussion. Also, vote for the best presentations, vote for the best questions, and check our Slack channel. Our speakers are there and sharing their slides, information, and whatever you require. Since we are a bit ahead of our schedule, we'll take small pause, and before next speaker, we'll get pause for 15 minutes. So see you all in 15 minutes.